So my name is Mandi Stade. I'm a horticulturist here at Meijer Gardens and Sculpture Park, and right now I'm going to show you how to repot an orchid. All right, so this particular orchid species is a dendrobium orchid, and this dendrobium was so root bound that it was actually stuck in this pot. It took a little finessing to get it out of the pot just a few minutes ago. So you might find that sometimes with orchids, it's even best to just cut the pot if you have a hard time getting it out. When you repot an orchid, you don't want to reuse the old pot. And I say that because the old pot might have contaminants in it. It might have fungal problems or bacterial residue in there. So it's safe to just get a whole brand new pot. And also with this dendrobium species, it definitely needs a larger pot somewhat. Some orchid species do like to be root bound, but this dendrobium still would benefit from a pot that's at least 2 inches larger than the old pot. So what I'm going to do is loosen the roots. So what I'm doing is I'm getting off all the old media from the root system. I'm knocking off as much of that old media as I can. And the media with this orchid species, the dendrobium is a tropical. So we plant these in a mix of fir bark, horticultural charcoal, and perlite. So I'm loosening the roots, which will help stimulate the roots as well for growth. And I'm just working my fingers in, getting rid of that, as much of the media as I can. We're keeping the stakes attached to the plant for support. And if you have any labels with your orchid plant, it's best to keep the label with it, just so you know exactly what orchid species you're working with, so you can provide the best care for the orchid. Most orchid species, they like to be in an environment that's at least anywhere from 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. For humidity, orchids, they like at least 70 to 80% humidity. So if you have an orchid in your home, the best way to supply that humidity is with a tray of pebbles, and you fill it with a little bit of water, a thin layer of water, and then you set the orchid pot on top of the tray, and the humidity will kind of go around the orchid and keep the moisture content around. Or you could place a humidifier close to the orchid plant. That would be great too. For lighting requirements with an orchid, you want to make sure that the orchid has bright but indirect light. You don't want full sun on the orchid because you'll see the leaves will scorch. So in your home, I would recommend a south or east facing window to place this orchid close to. And with the leaves, they're always a good indicator of the amount of light that it's getting. The leaves should be like a medium green color. If they're like a real faded grayish green, then that usually means that they're getting too much light. And if they're a very dark green, that means they're not getting enough light. So you want to find that medium green in the leaves, and that will indicate that you're getting the lighting that you need for that orchid. So now that I have all that old media off the root system, I'm going to work on putting this plant in its new pot. So I have this new pot here. It's just 2 inches slightly larger in diameter than the old pot. And I'm going to get this mixture of fir bark, perlite, and horticultural charcoal, and I'm just going to put a thin layer in the bottom of the pot so that the roots have something to rest and anchor onto. Okay, so I have that thin layer of the orchid media in the bottom of the pot just to anchor the orchid roots onto. And I'm going to nestle this orchid plant in the pot. And then I'm going to add more orchid media into the pot. And I'm just going to tuck it in. You want to make sure you push that media down in and you get rid of any air pockets. You want to make sure there's like a direct connection between the roots and the media itself. Sometimes what I'll do too is I'll use a bamboo stake and I'll press the media between the roots to get the media down in there. That seems to help really well. I have the media tucked in. I have this orchid plant all nicely potted into this pot. I have this one bamboo stake on the orchid. So now I think I need a little bit more support with this orchid branch. So I'm going to add in my metal stake that I have here. One helpful tip, cinnamon. You can actually use cinnamon to help control fungal problems with orchids. When you're repotting, you can add a little bit of cinnamon to the mix, and that'll help prevent the fungal spores from starting in the mix. So when you repot an orchid, one thing to note too is you got to take a good look at the roots. The roots should be, like in this case, this white color, or with phalaenopsis orchids or moth orchids, the healthy roots should be like a light greenish gray color. That indicates that they're getting the moisture from the air, they're healthy, they're lush. Now if you see any roots that are black or they're spongy, they're squishy to touch, then those are rotten roots and you should remove those roots as you're repotting. So it's good to keep a pair of sterilized pruners handy, and you'll want to prune off any black rotten roots as you're repotting. So that'll also encourage new root growth in the orchid plant because it won't be focusing its energy into the bad roots. With orchids, with the watering techniques, it varies from species to species as far as the watering goes. But with the epiphytic orchids, the hanging orchids that we have in here, we water those every day. With these potted orchids, it's basically on an as-needed basis. We will come in here daily and we will check the orchid plant, each individual plant. And by checking, I mean we lift up the pot, we feel how heavy the pot is, we look at the media inside. If the media is like light and it's dry, we know, okay, this orchid needs a watering. If the media is wet and it's dark in color, then you know that it's still moist and we should avoid watering it that day. So typically every other day for most of these potted orchids in here is sufficient enough. At home, a lot of people will use the ice cube technique, and it's a personal preference. I would not recommend watering orchids with ice cubes for at least the tropical species, because the tropical species don't tolerate cold on their roots very well, so I would not recommend using ice cubes with tropical orchids. And with fertilizing of orchids, we follow the technique to fertilize weekly. So with orchids, you don't want to use an orchid fertilizer at full strength. You want to use the fertilizer at a quarter strength at least. It needs a weak fertilizer, otherwise you'll see burn. You'll see fertilizer burn if you have something that's too highly concentrated. And during their growing months, their active growing months from spring through summer, we fertilize weekly with the orchids in this greenhouse. And you can use a well-balanced fertilizer like a 20-20-20. I'm saying the three numbers, that's the NPK ratio. The nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium ratio. So a well-balanced fertilizer is great with orchids, or like a 30-10-10 is a common orchid fertilizer to use. And then in the winter months, that is when a lot of these orchid species go dormant, and you want to cut back dramatically on fertilizing, and you want to cut back slightly on the watering as well. In the winter time here, we fertilize our orchids usually once a month, and that's sufficient enough because the dormant period, that's when these orchids are resting, so they don't require as much watering and fertilizing. They're resting, they're trying to gain the energy to force out that bloom cycle in January, February, and March. Thank you for joining me today with this repotting demonstration video, and I hope you gained some valuable information that you can use at home to take care of your orchids. And if you're ever inclined to come out and check out our orchids here, you can see them in our Lena Meijer Tropical Conservatory, as well as our Earl and Donnelly Holton Victorian Garden Parlor. Thanks for watching.